couple of weeks ago, at the beginning of January, I was having my usual daily walk just around the roads near to where I live. Now in January, this walk had been full of hazards where workmen had been digging holes in the path in order to provide new, faster broadband internet connection. But I was pleased to see that this particular stretch of path had been tidied up and new tarmac had been laid. However, as I got nearer to it, I saw what looked like several small mole holes along one side, creating little craters on the surface of the tarmac. This provoked my curiosity, so I knelt down to see what had disrupted the new flat footpath, and I was so surprised to see that some small spring bulbs were pushing their way through the new hard tarmac. They had been ignored because no one knew they were there. They'd been flattened and covered over by hot tarmac, and yet they still had the hope of life. They still had potential. They still thrived, and they will become beautiful flowers despite the hardship. This little moment spoke to me of there being hope even when all hope seems to have gone. It's easy to lose hope when times are tough. There's a story in the Bible in Genesis chapter 21 about Abraham's second wife. Her name was Hagar. So, for various reasons, Hagar found herself homeless, a single parent struggling to provide for herself and her young son. And at one point, we read about her wandering in a desert place with no one to turn to for help and nowhere to go. And as you can imagine, she felt that she couldn't carry on. There was no hope left in her. The Bible tells us that both she and her son were crying, hungry, thirsty, sorrowful, desolate. They sat down in despair. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the end. Have you ever felt like that? Felt abandoned? No one to share your anxieties with? You just want to run away, to give up, because it feels as though there is no hope. Maybe it's because of bereavement or health problems, relationship difficulties, loss of employment, money troubles, housing problems, feelings of depression. And there just seems to be no way forward. And so, in despair, like Hagar, you just feel like sitting down and giving up. But it wasn't the end for Hagar. Help was just around the corner, and her hope was to be renewed. Hagar wasn't a Jew, and she hadn't factored God into the equation. But just because Hagar didn't think of God, it didn't mean that he wasn't thinking of her, because the Bible tells us that God heard her child's cries. Hagar knew about God, but she didn't realize that he could be there with her until she heard the voice of an angel speaking to her from heaven. God hadn't left her. She wasn't totally abandoned. He had heard her heart's cry. And as I said before, there are times in our lives when we just lose hope. Times when despair creeps in and steals it away. But it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. Our hope can be renewed, because when we cry to God, whoever we are, Christian or non-Christian, if we call out to God, he hears our cry. He's just as tuned into us as we would be to our children. Hagar heard a voice from heaven telling her not to fear, a voice which promised a great future for her and her son. She hadn't been able to see past that day or even past that hour, but the angelic voice promised a new beginning and a hope for the future. And the story in Genesis goes on to say how that came about. But first things first, importantly, there was a promise of sustenance and strength. Hagar's eyes saw things differently from that moment on. God had opened her eyes so that she saw a well of water and was able to get refreshment for her and her son. When we encounter God, things don't stay the same. Our eyes are open to things that we didn't realize and things that we need to respond to. And it may be something just as simple as taking refreshment, or it may be that God will show us that we need to make changes in our lives. But one thing is certain, For those who cry to God, they will know their hope restored and find a future in his will. The writer of Genesis tells us that Hagar's son grew up and became an archer. Hope became a reality. The hard times are sometimes part of the path to finding the future that God sees for us. Remember the spring bulb I mentioned earlier? The hope in a bulb is renewed year after year. Heavy rain, wind, frost and snow, even tarmac, cannot destroy their hope of renewal. Don't give up. God has a future for you. If you need hope restored, here is a prayer for you. It is written in the Bible. To be honest, God doesn't very often speak to people through angels, but he does speak to us through his word, the Bible. This prayer asks God to open our eyes, just as Hagar's eyes were opened when God spoke to her. It's written in the book of Ephesians, chapter 1 and verse 18. I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which God has called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people. God bless you.